Well, good morning. Welcome to Wake Up in the Word. Thank you for joining me this morning. We're in Psalm 127. Psalm 127, as we're in these beautiful Psalms of Ascent. Beautiful song to look at this morning. So come join me. A good cup of coffee, the Word of God, getting ready for the day. I don't know what your day is like, but I'm just working. We're working, but just working differently, aren't we? Today, later on, with our visionary leadership team and our Columbia Metro Baptist Association here in South Carolina, we will be working. We'll be having a meeting, but it'll be a different kind of meeting. And some of you know what I'm talking about. It will be a Zoom meeting. Now, you may be using all kinds of different tools, shall we say, GoToMeeting or Google Meetings or whatever. We're meeting, just not in the same room around one big table. We're instead meeting around our devices and, yes, looking at little tiny pictures of each other while we discuss things important to our Baptist Association in the Midlands. And so, a lot of us are working, but it's different, isn't it, than it's ever been before. Yes, things change. But even when things change, it's very important to stick to the priorities and the foundations that will allow us to be strong. And that's what this psalm is all about today. Psalm 127, described as a song of Solomon, is all about those priorities of life. It begins in verse 1 saying, "Unless the Lord builds the house, its builders labor in vain." Now watch that word vain. You'll see it 3 times here. Unless the Lord watches over the city, the watchmen stand guard in vain. And in vain you rise up early and stay up late, toiling for food to eat, for he grants sleep to those he loves. Now notice how the word vain creeps into this psalm. If you think of King Solomon, what he had to do, and the wisdom of King Solomon, you'll think of a book he wrote that was all about vanity. It's called Ecclesiastes. And it really is a lengthy book where in 12 chapters or so, the king talks about how fruitless the very work of life is if God's not in it, if you don't have the clear understanding, the foundation of God in your life. And so Psalm 127 begins with using the word vain 3 different times. I am so glad that we can recognize the importance of these foundations. Lest the Lord builds the house, its builders labor in vain. Recognize that he had to, of course, build a spiritual house known as the temple. That was the great task before Solomon. But he also had to recognize there was something else he had to build and continue to keep strong, and that was the nation he was leading. And we're in difficult times when we need to be a nation being led by spiritual principles and godly principles. And I really appreciate those who bring us back to that foundation. But yet, we recognize that it's not popular to point that out. I think it's impressive when I see that in some of those pictures I saw of Mike Pence leading our council trying to figure out what to do with this COVID-19 epidemic, and they were getting on their knees and praying and asking for God's wisdom. I was just almost frightened to see there were those who would criticize a group of people asking for God's help to deal with a crisis like this. That's a sign that some people have lost perspective. I appreciate our leaders asking God for help. Secondly, I live in a state of South Carolina here in the United States, in which our governor leads a news conference every day on what's going on with COVID-19. And yesterday, he had to lead a very tough conference, a tough press conference, where we've just had to deal with the fact that tornadoes and terrible storms, thunderstorms and winds blew through our state, destroyed a lot of buildings, homes, and killed some of our citizens. We're having to deal with 2 disasters right here together on top of each other. He started that meeting with one of the leaders of our state being called upon to pray. And there was not only prayer permeating that meeting, but the discussion of seeking God's guidance and everything that's going on. And I really appreciate that about our governor in our state. Our governor and our attorney general actually did one of those Zoom meetings with us, some pastoral leaders here, to discuss how important the spiritual life of our people is during this time. And we were encouraged to do everything we could to keep people's spirits up and to keep them fed spiritually and to pray for them and with them throughout this crisis and do it any way possible. We were one of the first churches here, the first Sunday that we really could not meet in our building, to do a drive-in service. Of course, I had done those extensively when we were in Asheville, North Carolina as well. No big deal, and really turned out to be a great option for our people. We have a great time in our parking lot as we gather to worship. There's no contact, physical contact to folks. You can maybe wave at your friends across the parking lot. Hey, how you doing? We've noticed some people even bring their pets with them to church. I mean, it's just it's a hoot. We have a great time in the Lord, but keeping safe and making sure there's nothing can possibly, no disease, no viruses can possibly be transmitted among that crowd. You'd think that would be a beautiful option that every state would endorse. Yet we have heard the awful stories of some people being denied this basic freedom in their own state or in their own locality. I don't know about you, but I would not want this to be what my town was known for. Go with me, if you would, to the back seat of a little widow's car as she's on her way to church in Greenville, Mississippi. Her very small congregation, a Baptist congregation, matter of fact, in the most Baptist state in the Union, is going to have a drive-in service. Some of these folks are poor and they don't know how to do streaming services, and they aren't so much connected with the internet, but they know they can gather in the parking lot and they can not have contact with each other, be particularly safe in that environment, and yet still be prayed for and encouraged by their pastor. Yet what do they find when they get to church? More police cars than the cars of church members. They're ready to take down their tags and issue them citations, give them tickets for showing up to a drive-in service at church. Somebody got their priorities mixed up. Someone has messed up. Liberty Counsel immediately stepped in to defend that church, and it may be a court case before long. They had to step in Louisville, Kentucky, when those services were banned by local authorities. And then a judge stepped in and said, no, you are overstepping your bounds. These services are absolutely safe, a lot safer than going to the local Walmart to buy groceries, a lot safer than some of the other things we have deemed absolutely necessary because there's no physical contact whatsoever. And yet you've decided you're going to be heavy-handed and deny people the right to worship. Oh, listen, friends, we are entering some strange days, and folks are showing their true colors about some things. What happens when these foundations are destroyed? That's another question asked, of course, in the Psalms. So, folks, unless the Lord builds the house, we labor in vain. Solomon recognized that they could build a great city and a great temple, and the watchers on the wall could spot the enemy on the way in. But if God was not with them, they would still lose the battle. Friends, we're in a great battle today against not just viruses, but a lot of spiritual sickness all around us. If we don't recognize the priorities, if we don't recognize the Lord needs to be with us in this, then we will ultimately still lose. The priorities of the foundations that we have in our life, in our country, could be listed in three simple categories. One is God, a recognition of God, His Word in our life, the principles that our Creator has given us and handed down. And one of those principles is the second foundation, and that is family. And the family foundation is one that's being attacked more than any other in our country today. But I've got a sneaking suspicion that for many of our families, being stuck at home with each other is actually allowing you to grow closer together. You're spending more time playing with your children, helping them with their homework and other things that you weren't doing before because you were so busy on all that other stuff you thought was important. But then finally, our country. And so these foundations, we pull them together and recognize we have a responsibility to build a good and godly nation and to pass it down as a heritage to the next generation. That's what it talks about in verse 3. Sons are a heritage from the Lord, he says. Children, a reward from him. And you wouldn't think children are a reward in these days when some people talk about what a problem children are. Even a movement in our own nation that says, don't have children. Children are bad for the environment. You need to stop having children. Well, friends, all you have to do in one generation is stop having children. And two immediate things you'll notice. Number one, there'll be nobody to take care of you in your old age. You'll want the government to do it, but the government with fewer children that turned into taxpayers will have less resources to do it. And I shudder to think where we will land in our old age. But then, secondly, it's important to recognize that children are that reward to carry on the very principles we're talking about. Unless the Lord builds the house. Well, what happens if you stop building? You decide, well, we're just going to stop having children for a generation. Guess what? All it takes is one generation and you disappear. Then another group of people that decided it's okay to have children, and to keep doing that, they'll take over. And everything that was yours will no longer be passed along to your descendants. Someone else will have it. Well, God bless you. He goes on to describe how important children are. He says in verse 4, like arrows in the hands of a warrior are sons born in one's youth. So blessed is the man whose quiver is full of them. They will not be put to shame when they contend with their enemies in the gate. You know, in Solomon's day, you needed to have children because they're the ones that are going to defend you in old age. You know, that has not really changed. If you think you're going to depend on the government for everything, including your care as you grow older, I think you'll be shocked and surprised that the government doesn't care for you nearly as much as a family member would that loves you because they have a much deeper connection. Well, friends, let's don't miss it. Unless the Lord builds our house, and I'm not talking about the physical brick and mortar like you see around me. I'm talking about the real house, the house that is our personal spiritual lives, our connection with Him, the house that is our family structure and a nation built upon those truths. Unless the Lord builds the house, it's all in vain and it'll all crumble. We've seen how quickly something like a virus can shatter all our dreams and can bring a nation to its knees. Friends, I want to give you a little hint this morning. The thing that will see us through this and any other calamity that we are facing is a house built upon the Lord, a house built by the Lord, because unless the Lord builds the house, its builders labor in vain. God bless you. Thank you for joining me for just a few minutes this morning. We'll do this again tomorrow. We call it Wake Up in the Word.